Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the wonderful world of hutting. This is a Scottish Book Week event with Lesley Riddoch. I'd like to just introduce myself. First of all, I'm Donald McPhillimy, and I'm part of the 1000 Huts campaign group. So give you a running order for tonight's activity. We're going to have a few polls to begin with. And then follow that up with, I'm doing a short presentation on the campaign, the 1000 Huts campaign. Then we're going to hand over to Lesley for her presentation and finish up with some questions and answers. We've got 5 panelists. So on your screen, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see question and answer and chat. So if you have questions for us, please put those into the question and answer section, and we'll pick out some questions from there. If you want to have a conversation about what you're hearing and what your thoughts about huts are, then pop that into the chat and we'll pick that up afterwards. I'm going to move on now to say a little bit about our campaign. I'll just share the screen. Okay, the campaign is called the 1000 Huts campaign, and this is a new wave of hutting in Scotland. This is what traditional huts look like. This is one at Edelston, which is between Edinburgh and Peebles. And the beginning of the early 20th century was a great time for huts, and we think, and then they kind of died away. And we think that the early 21st century is going to be a great time for huts as well. This is Ninian, who's one of our panelists, and he kind of came up with the idea of having a new wave of huts in Scotland about 10 years ago at the Reforesting Scotland gathering in Torridon. First sowed the idea, and Ninian has got his own hut, which is, there you are. And our campaign is about changing planning policy, because before we started, there was no planning for huts. It wasn't possible to build a hut because there wasn't such a thing as a hut officially. And we've also campaigned for a change in building regulations, a code of conduct between hutters and the landowners. We're currently working on a pilot study on public land with Forestry and Land Scotland, and we're supporting the hutting movement, which is getting bigger and bigger. And Scottish Government asked us to define a hut. They came to us and said, can you tell us what a hut is? So we thought about it and came up with this. Simple building, used intermittently for recreation, not your principal residence. Maximum area 30 square meters, made from low impact materials, off grid, removable at the end of its life, and you can have a single hut or you can have a group of huts. And we produced this publication, New Hutting Developments, which is all about the planning side of huts. Where might you build them? What would they look like? How many would there be, etc., etc. So there's a lot of information in there. And then we've also worked on the building regulations side. So we've been successful in ensuring that huts have got a much lighter touch as far as building regulations are concerned than houses do, quite rightly. And so the building regulation side has been made much easier. We produced a good practice guide for this, and all the information is on our resource hub, which can be found at www.1000huts.org. So what might they look like? Well, this is Peter Cont, who's built a few, and a model of one of his huts. So they might look like this, which is the huts at Edelston, a group of huts at Edelston, made out of largely recycled materials, bits and pieces added on organically over time. Some people think this is beautiful. Some people think it's a bit ugly. I like it. I really like the sort of variation in the homespun nature of the traditional huts. Or it might look like this, which is one of the huts at Carth. Carth's got 140 huts. It's the largest remaining hutting site in Scotland. Or it might look like this, something completely brand new and original. This is a prototype hut at Falkland, which is a smaller hut. And this is at Inchriach near Aviemore. And this is another hut which is used by artists as a kind of retreat. And this one's located in the Isle of Egg, Sweeney's Bothy. And this is our site in West Fife, where we're hoping to have 12 huts being built this summer, 2021, and hutters living in huts on this site. Some of these people might be some of the hutters. And that's our resource hub, www.1000huts.org. So here we are back again. So I'd like to hand over now to Lesley Riddoch, who is going to talk about her new book. And Lesley is a well-known journalist, activist, and author. And luckily for us, she's also interested in huts. So over to you, Lesley.
Thanks very much there, Donald. So let me just kind of whip through this. This book is sort of, I keep saying to myself, it's taken 10 years to write, but actually I sort of stumbled into the hut. Well, it's not a hut, is it? It's a bothy that I had in 1985, which is definitely longer than 10 years ago. This is it. And, you know, it's strange now. We're also obsessed with taking photographs and selfies. But back then, kind of, you know, in the early 90s, you weren't taking pictures of yourself the whole time. So I've actually got very little from the back in the day. This was a whole series of professional accidents that I describe took me to this bothy, which I found by stotting up the hill, one Hogmanay, to see something that was on the top of a hill that I kept glimpsing while I was working for the BBC in Aberdeen, and had a house hired at the bottom of that hill. I assumed there was nobody in it, and I don't know who got the bigger sort of shock, the professor of anthropology who was in there renting it, or me, and the boyfriend of the day. We, you know, pitch dark, snow, everything, Hogmanay, quick thinking, got the half bottle out, Happy New Year. So that just about covered it up. But he realized, you know, I was casing it. And when he stopped renting it a couple of years later, he called me at the Beeb and said, look, you know, that wee place, Drumnagaro up on the hill, is still available. It's got a brilliant roof. I just want everyone to admire that roof. With no repairs whatsoever for so many decades, the roof was just a thing of beauty. And he said, look, it'll fall to pieces if someone doesn't rent it. Don't kid me. You were up there casing it. Come on, just go for it. So I thought, well, why not? I was living in Glasgow. Geez, it was only a 4-hour drive to get there. But it was, you know, it promised lots of little adventure. And it was just kind of like, yeah, it was a place beyond in every respect of the word. There was no running water. There was no electricity. There was no toilet. Almost everybody I knew at the time thought it was kind of basic beyond any approximation of the word, and found the whole prospect of not being able to wash properly absolutely horrific. I loved it. And this sort of adventure of the whole thing, I mean, that is not it as most flattering. This is it now. So the sheep have been allowed to run riot, and this is what happens when you get sheep everywhere. You get nothing else. But you can see from there, it was so brilliantly elevated, 1,200 foot up the side of the hill, Glenbucket in Aberdeenshire, that you could actually see Mount Keene in the distance. It was fabulous. And that's it. 15 years after I stopped renting it, nobody had taken it on. It was starting to fall to pieces, and it's still sitting like that now, I think. This is not a hut, really. This is a bothy. This is actually somebody's home, really. This is a shepherd's house high up on the hill. There are hundreds of them all over Scotland, and they were abandoned as lots of changes happened in farming, and it was deemed complete sort of uneconomic for people to continue to be shepherds in that way. And there's no road up to it, so it basically was going to be used for a weekend retreat, or it was just going to fall to pieces. So that was 7 years of glorious kind of nonsense, basically. And I massively enjoyed it, and wondered why I never met anybody else who felt the same, until I went to Norway. And Begorra, I suddenly discovered if I'd only been Norwegian, I would be normal, well, more normal. I went to Hammerfest again. I'm really compressing everything. The story is, it's all there in the book. But I went to Hammerfest. Why wouldn't you? World's northernmost town. My mum comes from Wick, sort of northernmost town in Scotland. Gets you kind of curious about northernmost things. So I met Inger-Lisa Matheson, who's on the roof there. She is the publicity officer for Hammerfest Strom, which is the tidal energy company that Hammerfest have got, world beating. The two of us got on like a house on fire, and she then kind of, when she realized I was interested in huts, she invited me to her one of her family huts. So this is her this is right in the Arctic then. This is the world's northernmost town. It's -50 in Hammerfest on a bad winter. Apparently the kids say that you can throw boiling water into the air and it turns to ice before it hits the ground. I think that's bullshit, by the way, but still, you know, kids, what they're like. So you have to get the snow off the roof or it crushes the huta. And these guys up in Finnmark have got roughly 1 hut per 7 people, which may not sound like a lot, but as far as I could find out in the 10 years of PhD that followed it, that's the highest density in the world. And that questions what the whole hut thing is about, because if you have the idea that huts are about getting away from it all, hello, these guys are away from it all. They're in the world's northernmost town. For them, this is about just sampling nature wherever you find it. You might have a hut where there is great fishing. This place, Skadi, is right beside one of the best salmon fishing rivers in Norway. You might have it where you go further inland, ice fishing. You might have it somewhere near where you pick cloudberries in the autumn. You might have it where you pick moss, because people still do that kind of foraging. I mean, you just might have huts, plural, wherever you like. And across Norway, people will often have one hut up in the fjell, the mountains, for skiing and so on, and another hut right by the fjord for swimming in the summer. That's quite normal. And it kills me. Because I just think back to Scotland, the appetite, the expectation, no one expects that. This is the kind of luxury money pretty much cannot buy you in Scotland because of the way our land is owned. But anyway, it's nice to be somewhere where this kind of stuff is normal. This is the picture of Marianne's dog's grave. You might think this is a little bit strange, but to me, this is what marks out an important fact, that the hut is the permanent home. Because you may change your first home many times in your life for kids, for work, but you don't change your hut. And to me, the evidence of that was always, where do you bury your dogs? And they are nearly always buried at the hut. Now, there's a saying in Norwegian, home is where the hut is. And what does that mean for us not to have huts? It means we don't have a home. So the kind of people who have huts, I went on the most extraordinary jolly trip around the biggest hutting community in Finnmark, Skadi, and came across Ove Huda, who is sitting here with his dog. Now that's a classic interior of a hut, you know, the old wood paneling, the patchwork, you know, it's so traditional, the Norwegians, for all that they seem to be kind of very, very sort of slick technologists, they actually really go for the old stuff. And look, I love the kind of Nescafe jar that's just sitting right in front of him. That's the old hut. This is him building the new hut with all the guys that I met that time, helping him build it, because dugnad, which is kind of community, well, it's a kind of your gesture of support, community self-help, community effort, is what you use to build things. It rather helps that Ove's a glazier. So he has pretty much sorted everybody else's windows out in their huts. So he got a huge amount of help when it came to putting his own one up. And this is another thing we've lost. If you don't have a reason to have building skills, why would you keep them? So, you know, people are quite able to turn their hands to stuff in Norway because they've got so many huts. And if you're building in wood, you need to do lots of repairs all the time, which is part of the fun of it. So after going to Hammerfest, I didn't take much persuading to just get hugely interested in huts in Norway, and came across a fabulous paper that led me to Linoya, which is a little island off Oslo in Oslo Fjord. In fact, look, there it is. This is Linoya in the foreground, and there is Oslo in the background, some of the most expensive real estate in the world. And yet, the people who own these little modest wooden huts are still the direct descendants of the East End working class Oslo people who were given these huts in 1922, which is kind of staggering. So this gave me a wee place to look at, because 1922, bizarrely, was the date that Carth began, more than 1,000 miles east. Is that right? Yes. So here they are. Carbeth, Linoya, the two of them, and the comparisons are interesting. I'm going to just read you a bit from the book since it is about a book. And this was about my attempts to find out more when I'd arrived in the depths of winter to try to find out more about this little island, Linoya, and had turned up for the ferry. This might or might not work as I scroll through the pictures, who knows. So anyway, the boat turned up as timetabled, and within minutes, I was gliding towards Linoya. The only snag, pretty much no one else was. I was finding out the hard way that hutting on the Huta Islands is strictly seasonal, May till October by law, and the trip offered only tantalizing glimpses of brightly coloured, snow-topped and evidently empty wooden huts with no openings for comradely chat. Frustrating. There was also no queue for the number 60 bus back into Oslo. Hardly anyone was waiting in the snow except a young couple with their daughter clutching skis and ski poles. The bus wheeled into the turning circle and the doors swung open. It was my only chance to connect. Would you like a hand with a bag? Yes, thanks. Can you take the ski poles? There was no note of surprise in Maria's voice, like she got offers of help from total strangers every day. I wondered how bold I could be, given the low odds of meeting any other Huta dwellers from Linoya till the summer. Ferry. Were you on the ferry from the islands? I knew she was. Yes, were you over there too? Her English was almost perfect. I'd been on the top deck of the boat for half an hour in the biting cold. Despite all my thermal gear, my chin was frozen solid and I didn't have the energy to be evasive. Yes, I was upstairs taking photos. I'm actually doing research on huts because in Scotland, we don't really have them. Really? We have a huta over there. Well, it belongs to my father. Well, to his new wife. Well, to her father, actually. You can email me if you like. I glowed involuntarily with all the delicate, hesitant excitement of someone who had just been propositioned. If only I could find a pen and get my frozen hand to work, to write down their email address before they got off the bus. Maria's partner scrambled in his pocket. Here's a pen. I'm Frederick. Hi, I'm Lesley. This was quite surreal. I scribbled their email addresses down and sighed with relief when their details were safely transcribed onto the back of a crumpled receipt in large frozen baby writing. They started scrambling for bags at the National Theatre stop in the city centre. What next? Would you like to come for a coffee? We're meeting friends. And just like that, my afternoon and Frederick's hutting experience began to unfurl. Linoya, don't pronounce the D, was first camped on by working people from Oslo in around 1909. Then, in the 1920s, the authorities allowed them to build huts the size of their tents. As a result, most huts today are just one large room. There's no running water in winter. The pipes have to be drained to avoid ice damage, and folk boil snow for water. The majority of hutters have always been working class socialists from Oslo, and many are still printmakers. At least this was Frederick's version. The island is indeed only 1 mile by half a mile, and people pick mushrooms in the summer and get involved in all sorts of communal activities like swimming galas. Frederick, a poet, goes out to write and stays inside the cabin without socializing. This is not what you're meant to do, he confides. Even a hut lover like myself can't quite see how anyone can find seclusion on a tiny island with 300 huts at the height of summer when everyone's outdoors along with friends and extended family. Well, that's why I use other huts as well, says Frederick, who recounts a stay in his own huta, a very basic house on the south coast on an island 5 hours travel from Oslo. This is more like it. Frederick recounts, an old local man asked me how long I planned to stay. It was October, and I said I would stay till my birthday next July. He said if I survived January, he would bake some bread. On the first day of February, there was a nail hammered into the door with a bag containing 2 loaves. Hardy is hard for in Norwegian, not so different a word, but Norwegian hardiness runs on fairly epic lines compared to our own. And that's what makes their Huta culture so fascinating. Despite their willingness to cross-country ski in sub-zero temperatures just because it's Sunday, most Norwegians are quite soft when it comes to their hytte. Not for them, the makeshift water trough shared with cows, the telegraph pole pushed into the fire, or indeed any open fire too wasteful of heat compared to a log-burning stove. Norwegian hytte are generally reachable in a day's travel and function properly because in subarctic climes they must, and because they mostly accommodate families with children, not eccentric loners, though before any complaint, there are a few of them too. A university professor once told me a hytte helped rescue the relationship with his children after divorce. I bought the hytte deliberately to win back my children. They came every summer for the whole 6 weeks. Did they like it or come out of obligation? I asked them recently. They said the hytte gave them a normal childhood. For a guilty, absent dad, you can't imagine how important that was to hear. My daughter learned to swim at the beach there. I could leave her even when she was just 7 because there were so many teenage girls around. She loved it. It was unbelievably beautiful. The hut is basic. We have to walk or ski up for half an hour. That's the trouble with these new fancy hytte. They may have roads up, but if the roads dip, the cars get stuck. It's easier to just use the old paths and carry the stuff up. That was true enough, I reflected. Eventually, I was doing the same at Drumnagaro, humping everything up with a stoic donkeyness only I would ever appreciate. So, will you come back to Linoya in the summer? Maria brought me back to earth with a bang. Of course, then you must visit Tuta Norman. She knows everything about the island. Say Holger's daughter sent you. Take our map. She's in hut number 280. So that was kind of my initiation to Linoya. And I then jumped backwards and forwards to this island so many times I can hardly remember. And then, of course, began to compare it to what we have in Scotland. Now, we've already had a quick summary from Donald, but look, here's back 1922. Yep, back 1922 in Carbeth. And exactly the same thing is happening without anybody coordinating it. There are tents at the top, which are morphing into huts. The reason that any of this really happened is down to one extraordinary man, William Ferris, that nobody has heard of. I only found out about him by accident. I was trying to find him in his relatives in the phone book. Some of you may know that there's quite a kind of frisky bunch of Ferrises in Glasgow who are potentially involved in some pretty serious action. And I got a few of them in my first trawls of the phone book. But beginning to hone down a bit, I thought, William Ferris, this is all the things he set up. The Camping Club of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the Scottish Council of Physical Education, the Scottish Rights of Way Society, the Scottish Camping Club, the Scottish Ramblers Federation, and he set up the first youth hostel in the UK. Anyone heard of him? No. So the reason that you probably haven't heard of him is because he didn't come from the right side of the lines. This guy, William Ferris, was born in 1894. He was one of 11 children in Govan, of whom only 2 reached the age of 5. So he was a classic working class Scot, but classic too in the west of Scotland, in that he was brought up in a really strong socialist household and culture. He was in the socialist Sunday school movement, which had a great conceit of, well, encourage people to have a good understanding of themselves. And I was going to say a good conceit of themselves, but to have some self-pride and not to be beholden, not to be craven, and to respect everybody around them. Girls were given equal weight as boys. And in all this, the long series of stuff I was able to find about the Socialist Sunday School, you begin to find William Ferris was a walking textbook of all that he'd been taught. He was in the Clarion movement as well, another big socialist movement that had huge amounts of different activity. He was the secretary of the Clarion Players, who set up the Citizens Theatre. He was in the Clarion Cyclists, who were a massive thing. Cycling was huge in Scotland, the west of Scotland particularly, all the way through the interwar period. So he was really the pivotal character in all of this. And this is him, a very early picture of him off on one of his jaunts with a pal somewhere, having found a hedgehog. this is him later. I love this. This is Gallas. This is like Gallas on a stick, William Ferris. But this was after he had managed to persuade the landowner at Carbeth to have huts, and had also managed to get the pond set up to become a swimming pool. And this is him in later life. He died really prematurely, I think at the age of about 63, but I mean, a fabulous man. Now, what happened? Well, he had, with 4 other men who were in the army, they were all in the Highland Cycling Battalion. Cyclists were providing the signals and all the communications between the lines in the First World War. These guys, it's extraordinary they survived, but they did. And they were saving in the War Saving Certificate scheme to just put some money away for why? To be able to afford a little hut at Carbeth, which is somewhere they'd camped before the war, and it was keeping them going. So this letter, which William Ferris cleverly got his commanding officer to write to Alan Barnes Graham, realizing that class matters and that he needed an officer to write to a landowner. This letter was an appeal to Barnes Graham to let them have a hut. They had saved £30 between them, and they hadn't died in the process. And Barnes Graham said no. If you read these letters, it would break your heart to think that that was possible. But from the letter that is then sent by William Ferris after he's been demobbed in 1919, you see why. He talks about wishing to be able to speak to your neighbor who's worried about Bolshies being on the land beside you. And remember the times, 1917, we've just had the Russian Revolution. We've just had in 1919, in fact, by July, we've also had the general strike, the George Square incident. There'd also been a huge change in the budget so that death duties had been really ramped up to 40%, which in the course of the First War meant that lots of estates actually ended up having to sell large portions of their sporting estates. And something like a quarter of all land in Scotland changed hands in 3 years between 1918 and 1921. So at that point, people thought that land ownership, feudal land ownership, as we know it in Scotland, was going to end because of most of the taxes that had been imposed, and it didn't. This was the point when the Gallas William Ferris sashayed up to try to get huts on the land at Carbeth. And it was no surprise that he got bounced out. But nothing dissuaded. He turned up anyway, started camping, got to know Alan Barnes Graham, charmed him. I don't know if there was a person in the universe that this guy wouldn't have charmed. And he managed to persuade him eventually to let people have huts there. The condition was quite important. Barnes Graham said, that's all right, but you have to organize everything. And as a result of that, the only person who never had a hut at Carbeth was William Ferris. So he was the bridge that allowed everybody else to have what he never sampled. This is just briefly what he, was able to create. This is a cartoon of William Ferris, which is great. It's called The Optimist, and it's kind of got his slightly bulky form, quite right. But he also had this bike custom made. He got the bike made by a specialist in Glasgow. It had long panniers for all the tents and everything. He got lightweight tents made by Blacks of Greenock, and I got the bike made with lots of gears so that he could get out to Carbeth. I mean, that was quite a big deal in a sense to get, but that's how mad keen people were on cycling back then. The idea Scots were just wrecked couch potatoes is utterly untrue. And of course, here we are, in parallel, that other cartoon is Linoya over in Norway at around the same time. Just loads of people doing what comes naturally. The two of them both had swimming associations. There we are, quite formal in the case of Carbeth, and still going strong over in Linoya. So finally, where have we got to? Carbeth lives on, but no thanks pretty much to the Scottish Parliament or to the legal situation or to sort of fairness, because they were threatened with eviction in the 1990s. Many of their huts mysteriously burned down. The grandson of the original landowner who consented to huts had sort of lost interest. And it really was a 10-year rent strike, the most incredible protest, the failure of a petition to the new Scottish Parliament for help. And finally, what really helped them was Stirling Council, because Stirling Council designated each of these huts a conservation area. And after that, nobody wanted to buy the land. It took a bit longer to get a deal, but I think it was nearly 2 million quid later, the hutters had bought the land. They'll be paying it off till 2035. They have a waiting list just as long as anybody's arm. They've closed it. There's huge demand for this. And yet Carbeth is absolutely unique because that's not the general story. Other hutting sites like Seaton Sands, folk may not even know that Seaton Sands was a hutting site, but it was. This is it back in the 20s again. I think you'll see lots of old railway carriages there, which is widely used. But Seaton Sands hit gentrification, Town and Country Planning Act, raised hygiene standards, and eventually converted into, yeah. Now, I mean, I don't want to be sniffy about anything because this is all people can do. Most people can only afford to get a caravan, but gee, it does sort of hurt to see actual things that meant something to families being cleared away so that plastic huts on wheels can be introduced. And whether you worry about the aesthetic of it or not, the key point is the ownership. These people do not own the land. And at some point, it's quite possible for people to be told they've just had, they have to basically get rid of old caravans. And at that point, they have nothing. Barry Downs folk, it was a huge hutting site. It probably was the model for the Bruins, Button Ben. But after, again, same story, 3 generations, it was sold to an owner who wasn't interested, tried to evict everyone. This is Jim Rowling, who I knew quite well from Maryhill. He was one of the last guys who just defiantly kept using these huts. Again, when the hutters weren't there, mysteriously every window of every hut was smashed. The police said no one had reported it. And it was an appalling sight. And eventually, despite everybody trying to maintain that they had rights to be there, the trouble is in law, you don't. In Scotland, if you are the temporary tenant of a hut, you have no legal rights. And no one has been able to change that. The Cloche near Greenock, these are often, many of them are just shipping containers that have got doors cut into them to stop vandals coming in, and also to protect them from the high tide. This is where Scots are stuck by and large at the moment, in the margins and in very difficult places. So we've become hardy loners and indoor families. That's the size of it. In life, you consume what is available and affordable. In Norway, that is land. In Scotland, that is beer. So our stories are very different, and this is the numbers. In Norway, there's about 500,000 huts. In Scotland, there's only 500 to 600 huts, despite the efforts of the campaign. And that's the rate of hut ownership in particular. The big differences, we could talk about that later, but most of it comes down to the way that land is owned. So what are we missing? Well, I think quite a lot. And we can change this, but we need to work together. We need to make the case strongly and lobby for change, as well as taking the small opportunities that are sitting around us to try to get huts pushed into the landscape again, particularly into forestry, because that's the norm across the rest of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lesley. We'll give you a clap anyway. Yeah, welcome back. This is the yeah, just to say, fascinating. You know, I mean, I've been to Norway a few times, and we've got so much to learn from our Nordic neighbours. You know, in all sorts of ways. I mean, their history has been different from ours, which is why things have turned out a bit differently in the two countries. But there's so much which is kind of similar and kind of resonates, you know, and there's so much that we can learn from them, and hopefully there's things they can learn from us as well. And I just think, you know, that kind of North Sea divides, you know, it seems like it's far kind of more significant than it actually is. You know, we need to kind of, you know, build the links, which I know you're doing with Nordic Horizons, you know, with the Nordic countries. So we're going to take some time now to look at, to answer some of your questions. And I'd like to introduce the other fellow panelists that we've got for you this evening. So start off with Richard Heggie is our friendly planning consultant. And if there's any kind of planning issues, he's the first person that we go to. He runs a business called Urban Animations in Edinburgh. And he helped us with the planning application for the Carnock Hutters in West Fife. And I've mentioned Ninian already. You've seen him on the slide. And as I say, Ninian kind of first conceived this idea of 1,000 huts almost exactly 10 years ago. And Lesley, we haven't quite managed to sort of, you know, build all these huts yet, but we're kind of on our way. We're on our journey, and it seems to take time. And but there are some huts popping up at Falkland, which is where Ninian lives. And if you've got questions about actual huts in actual woods, Falkland is probably the place in Scotland which has got the most new huts at the moment. And then Karen's my kind of sister in arms in the 1,000 Huts campaign. So the two of us run the campaign together with a lot of help from other people. But we're the two who kind of, you know, are at the core of it and have been for most of the period of time of the campaign. And Karen's done a lot of the work on the changing the planning legislation and the building legislation, and also developing the new resource hub. And we've got Frances, who's one of our support group members. And Frances helped us organize the rally in Dundee last year. And she's going to share out the questions for us, and then we're going to spread them out amongst the panel. So I think that's everybody. Yeah, 5 of us in the panel, that's right. And Frances is going to give us the first question.
Okay, Donald, we have had a few questions in for Lesley. One particular from Nessa says that Norwegians learn from a very early age how to be the outdoors, fantastic navigators, swimmers, skiers, and they understand about leaving no trace and how to have fires outdoors without setting the whole hillside alight. What do you think we need to do to encourage hutting, ensure that folk use them responsibly?
Kindergarten, outdoor kindergarten. You know, this is these are self-reinforcing things, because kids are used to going to their parents and grandparents and bidey inns and everybody's huts. They have less fear of the great unknown, and it's sort of like it's a birthing experience to be out really in the huts. So it actually makes it possible to have the kindergarten that are mandatory from the age of about 1 till 6 or 7, which is the norm for countries around the world, not 4 or 5. That those kindergarten, many of them are outdoors. By law, Norwegians have to have kids, have got to have 1 day a week outdoors in kindergarten. And many places just decide it's simpler to have them outside the whole time. So you've got this kind of the kindergarten reinforces the hutting reinforces the kindergarten. So of course, when you try to go around and just do low-hanging fruit collection, it's hard to get the societal buy-in that Norway has got all round. For all sorts of reasons it would take far too long to go into. But yes, that's the difficulty. And I mean, I know people get very aerated about dirty camping and, you know, as it were, disrespect for the natural environment. But what have we got as a society here? I mean, people are not basically welcome in large parts of Scotland on the land, except under very constrained circumstances. And actually, what we've got are people who don't have a physical release, which is what everyone else at our latitude has. They have a chemical release. And I mean, I'm not excusing. I live right beside the coast, and I spent a lot of lockdown, like everyone around here, taking all sorts of shite basically off that beach, gobsmacking amounts of sort of abusive nature, if you like. But it cannot be a coincidence that we have the least regular access to the land and in a sense, the most trashing behavior towards it. So I want to see a really big rebalancing of this.
Yeah, Francis, another question, please.
Okay, Lesley, I don't know if you want to quickly ask, there's been quite a few questions coming in. What sort of amount do huts exchange hands for in Norway? Do you see hutting being working class in Scotland? And how would you sell it to the non-hardy?
Let's take them one at a time.
Yes, I didn't even get the first part of that.
What was the first one again?
What sort of amount do huts exchange for money-wise in Norway? And do you see it being working class in Scotland?
Well, huts, there's a lot of variety of huts now, and because actually land has been traditionally quite cheap in Norway, as time goes on and you have to rebuild or repair your hut, you know, many people will think, well, why don't I just stick an extra kitchen on? Why don't I just stick an extra bedroom on? And then people will think, well, I don't know, why don't we just try and get some Wi-Fi? Why don't we just get some electricity? So over time, their problem is that they are now getting huta palasser, and you don't need Norwegian to translate that. And they're having to now think about planning restrictions. You know, the micro-planned way that Britain is not normal. So they're having to think about how to constrain development, because left to their own devices, people are just still, there's 9,000 huts being built this year, even with lockdown. So the demand is still absolutely massive. And yes, some huts can change hands for £250,000. But bear in mind, the Norwegian economy is so strong that actually that, relatively speaking, means less, because the kroner is worth 2 to 3 times the amount of the pound sterling. So yes, in Scotland, hutting is, in Norway, the more money you earn, the more likely you are to have a hut. In Scotland, it is exactly the reverse. But let's look at potentially why, because 80%, 88% of people in Norway own the land that their hut is built upon. In Scotland, about 88% are tenants of the land, which means they can be chucked off at the drop of a hat, and they can be subject to huge increases in rent when they finally have the grandson of somebody who was keen on it and just doesn't want to have them there anymore.
Karen, can I ask you to comment on whether we see the hutting movement as being working class in Scotland? You're muted.
Sorry. The campaign was set up with the idea that it would be to try to help people who had least access to hut life and who could most benefit from hut life. And that's what one of the sort of primary goals of the campaign has been all along. The reality of trying to make that happen is something that has been a hard thing to face up to, and you know, it's a work in progress. I think for all of us involved in the campaign, the whole idea was not to sort of create some new kind of tourism opportunity for people with loads of money. The idea is to try to find ways to make it more accessible and affordable. And the first way we started to try and do that was to remove barriers to hutting, both in terms of planning and building regulations, to try to reduce costs. It's still expensive, but to build a hut or to get land, but there are ways of doing it, and there are people doing it. And if you look on our resource hub at www.1000huts.org, you'll see all sorts of ways to help make progress to achieve that. And there is a section on affordable hutting, which has about 10 different ways of reducing the costs, ranging from sharing huts and renting land together with other people, and down to basically building smaller huts. Like, some of it's just common sense, but there's and also cheaper building methods. But well, the issue of building cheaply is a big and complex one that's I'm sure all the builders on this call will be have plenty to say about. But yeah, sorry, it's a bit of a how long is a piece of string question. I think everyone. The only way to make it happen is for us all to try our best. Okay,
thanks, Karen. This is a subject we return to quite often and we think about quite a lot. So we'll just leave it there for now, but you know, it'll definitely be cropping up again in the future. So Francis, another question?
Okay, we have a question from Scott, quite a lengthy one, but it is to do with planning. He has 5 acres in East Lothian and has chatted to planning about building a hut in the woods, but they've said they're unlikely to support it because the hut might be seen by walkers from the forest road. So how can he convince planning to let him build a hut? Can you give any advice on how to do that?
I think this is a good question for Richard, if you could have first go at that.
Yeah, thanks, Donald. East Lothian's probably not the ideal place to be trying to build a hut. They do tend to be quite restrictive on development in the countryside there. And this is one of the issues with planning across the country. You're never quite sure what kind of answer you're going to get when you ask it. I did read that question earlier in the comments trail, and it just made me think immediately that that's a very weak reason for refusal in terms of planning policy, and I think that could well be challenged. I think there are a number of other applications in East Lothian at the moment, so I think this applies across the board. If you're thinking about coming into the planning process with an application for a hut, have a look at the council website. You can go into the planning e-planning site on the council page. You can search. You could probably, if you just search for the word hut amongst the planning applications, you'll see other examples in that local authority area, and that'll help to give you an understanding of the way they have dealt with applications or are dealing with applications. And then equally, you could go across other local authorities to other council planning sites and find other planning applications there, which you could then potentially use to contrast. So Fife, for example, has approved a number of hutting applications. You could look at how that's been handled by the planners and present a contrasting case to the East Lothian team. That might get you some luck.
Okay, thanks, Richard. That's great. Francis, another question, please.
We've got one saying, is the same permanent connection to the family hut possible in Scotland without the security of owning the land the hut is on?
That's an interesting question. Ninian, do you want to have a go at that? Or Karen? Ninian first.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in. So it's a good question, and I think, gosh, the longer that you are linked to a piece of ground, the deeper that connection comes. And I think you could have very, very long-term tenancies of land. And at Falkland, we'd gone for 20 years, and there was an argument for going for less, an argument for going for more. But I think our sense was to see, partly because Falkland's also an interesting ownership journey, that actually we would kind of go on a 20 years and then it could go kind of hopefully much longer. So I think there are other ways, but I think owning the land, yeah, is in a sense you have more control. So I suppose whether you own it individually or whether there's some collective ownership, which I think a lot of people are exploring at the moment, or have a long-term lease. And there's no reason why you don't put in, you could have a 100-year, you could have a 200-year lease for a hut. There's no reason that you couldn't.
Yeah, thanks, Ninian. I think the mistake that a lot of people made in the past, they didn't realize they were making it, but they didn't have a lease, they didn't have a contract, they didn't have an agreement. They just had a sort of like a gentleman's agreement, with the landowner or whatever, and of course they had no legal rights came with it at all. So they were in a totally weak position, if the landowner changed their mind. So what we're doing is we're not insisting, but we're recommending really strongly that anybody that wants to have a hut, or a group of people who want to have huts, need to have a lease with the person who owns the land, and all these issues about the length of the lease and why the lease would be terminated, under what circumstances, that all needs to be sorted out. And as a result of that, then that should give a lot more security of tenure to the hutters, and protection to the landowner as well. Karen and then Lesley.
I was just going to quickly say that to help you sort of see the different things that should be included in your lease, you can look at our voluntary code of good conduct for between hutters and landowners, which is on our resource hub, www.1000huts.org. It goes through many different issues that you'll need to consider finding an agreement on, because that's the only legal protection you'll have if you don't own the land.
Lesley?
Well, really, where Scotland is still actually where those guys in Linoya were in 1922. And the significant thing for them was that island was owned by the government. It wasn't owned by the council, which tried many, many times to get them out. It wasn't owned by a private landowner. And when you look at all the islands around Oslo Fjord, one by one, the ones that were owned by private owners or the council disappeared out of the, being huttable. The only ones that stayed were the ones with the government, because it would look too bad for the government to evict people. And that's where Donald's comments about, Forestry Commission Scotland, or whatever it is, land, whatever these days, seems to me to be very fruitful, because that's the nearest analogy. Once you get huts set up on Forestry Commission land, which is basically held for the whole of Scotland, they're managing it for us. That, I think, is going to be politically impossible to get people out of. But at the same time, I've always thought we need to just try to really campaign on this point about tenants' rights, because this isn't to say that this isn't to overturn any kind of input landowners can have. If tenants behave badly, they can be asked to leave. But at the moment, you have no rights. And what can happen to these other communities could just very well happen to private arrangements again. Give it 3 generations and the grandson or daughter has lost interest. And there's nothing currently to help you unless you can find a handy Stirling council on your side.
Thanks very much. Francis, next question.
Quite a few questions about land ownership. Gary's asking, why does there seem to be so little appetite in the Scots Parliament to do anything about land reform?
Hold on, simply one question at a time. Is that it?
Oh no, it's part of the same question. Is it simply ignorance of the history of land ownership?
So it's a question about the Scottish Parliament and why they're not doing enough in land reform. Is it out of ignorance? It's definitely not out of ignorance. But yes, they're definitely not doing enough. But they do. There is a land commission, which we didn't used to have. So, due to pressure from the Greens and so on, there is a sort of a mechanism. And I think it's quite positive, to have a land commission. I don't think they're anything like as strong, or they're making strong enough changes as yet. But the fact that they exist is there's an organisation keeping an eye on the land reform ball, which there wasn't an organisation doing that before. So we'd all like to see faster change, but at least there's an organisation there, which is a start. Lesley, I think you've maybe got some views on this.
I despair, honestly. I don't know what the blooming problem is. But for whatever reason, the Scottish government is just not going to really put anything together that's tremendously far-reaching. And it's maddening because, we've had 2 lots of land reform. The first was egg-shaped, and it came in the wake of egg, which was not helped by anything in the Scottish government because it didn't exist. It was 1997, the egg buyout. And in a way, there was so little help from politicians that I think, in a guilty thing, they decided land reform would be the first thing tackled. So fine. So the template was community buyouts because that's what egg had done. Well, that's fine, but you find that the countries that work really well have no community buyouts. They have fair laws about land. So in Norway, you can't buy productive land unless you've done 5 years at agricultural college. And I don't know if the Duke of Buccleuch wants to spend 5 years brushing up stuff in, you know, his local college, that would be fine. But that's a rule, and that's common in the Nordic countries. And there's also one which I noticed some questions about boplikt, which is one that Gordon asked about. This is the law that's really quite important for the context of huts, because lots of people think, what, more second homes? You know, already rural Scotland is in crisis because all existing housing stock is being bought by wealthy incomers for second homes. But the beauty of what's done in Norway for the last 70 years is that inserted into the title deeds of every home is whether it is a permanent first home or a permanent second home. And it's not possible to buy a first home unless you are going to be a first home owner. The Danes have a rule that you can't own a holiday home unless your first home is registered in Denmark. You know, there are all sorts of ways of doing things, and these are already societies which have tens of thousands of landowners, not the concentrated tiny number that we have uniquely on Earth, practically, or the developed world. But they still have to intervene in the marketplace to to police behavior. So I would love to see something like that happening. And the key point is that huts are a solution for rural Scotland, because without huts being built as the kind of dwellings that you would only occupy at the weekends, that would be new buildings built surplus to existing stock. That's what stops. And to have laws so that you can't buy a first home unless you're going to live in it, that would basically allow us to have what, roughly speaking, the Norwegians have, which is thriving rural communities and loads of people in huts. Because at the moment, what we've got is people poaching first homes in rural areas for use as second homes. And it's given the whole idea of having a holiday home a bad name.
So when you came here this evening, you probably thought we're talking about, you know, kind of funny sheds on you know, that you live in, and that's the end of it. But actually, it's connected to everything else, and it is actually connected to some of the major political issues in Scotland at the present time. Francis, another question.
There's a few questions about planning, but someone's asking if Yvonne McLeod, any changes to training for planners over the time? Are newly qualified planners more or less likely to support an application?
Put that back to Richard again.
I get all the best questions. I'm not aware of any particular training that's been made available. There were a few events that were hosted by some of the young planners, regional groups, a few years back after the policy change. That's something that we've been discussing as a potential way forward in trying to get the message across to planners that hutting's not something to be scared of. I think in too many places there's a bit of concern in planning authorities over potential impacts on the landscape and the countryside. You know, these are relatively small impacts that, in terms of visual impact, you know, if you drive around any bit of Scotland's landscape that has any kind of population anywhere, you're going to see enormous agricultural buildings or lots of smaller scale buildings in the landscape. So what's the problem with some small huts tucked in the woods? I think there's a big kind of strategic question there to look at with planning in general. What's the land for? What's the landscape for? What's the countryside for? Is it just something that we want to protect from development other than agriculture and forestry? Or is it something that we want to get people out using and enjoying? It pretty obviously leads on from that it's not an easy thing to set out a short training course to change people's attitude to those kind of questions. But we do need to keep picking away at this. to change attitudes and get a better understanding of what hutting actually is, so that when you bring forward your planning application, it doesn't look scary.
Thanks, Richard. Lesley next, and then Karen, could you maybe say something about what the campaign is trying to do at the moment, because it's one of our priorities, working with planners. Lesley.
Yeah, this question of the sort of blight of huts is actually one of those sections in the book is looking at the plotlanders, because some of the great expansion of huts happened in the south of England around London, places like Canvey Island, Shoreham. In fact, Basildon was a complete hutting community until the 1940s. There wasn't a house in it, it was huts. So lots of the Londoners had kind of jumped out, got plots of land during the interwar period when land values crashed. This scared the bejesus out of the kind of middle classes. And strangely enough, it was a Labour government who brought in the Town and Country Planning Act, which pretty much said development happens in cities, the farmers have the countryside, and it pulled the drawbridge up so high that huts fell beneath. So everything makeshift was actually seen as aesthetically ugly. And the kind of things that people said are really quite astonishing. I mean, this was one report was commissioned by a guy, J.A. Steers. I still can't find out what his Christian name was, but I think that tells you something about the nature of the man, who did this survey of the coastline. And in it, he said, Canvey Island was an abomination, a town of shacks and rubbish. It caters for a particular class of people, and short of total destruction and a new start, little, if anything, can be done. So, I mean, that's, people aren't even, they're not pulling their punches. This is quite openly said. Another guy, Ronald Lockley, who was a prolific author of the time and quite influential, was talking about places like Jaywick. And these places had really sort of a lot of solidarity because they were working class people who were already organized in unions in most of their workplaces. But he said, nothing but a dictatorship will save the English coast in our time. When the millennium arrives, when battleships are turned into floating world cruising universities, perhaps their guns, as a last act before being spiked, will be allowed to blow to dust the hideous, continuous and disfiguring chain of houses and huts, which by then will have completely encircled these islands. It is not a small prejudice that is lurking in the background here. And I just want to finally say, two brilliant anarchist historians, Colin Ward and Dennis Hardy, wrote a brilliant book called Arcadia for All about the plotland experience mostly. And they observed, I think, very insightfully that class was the main driver of hostility towards hutters, particularly the plotlanders. And they write, the Thames with Eton, Windsor and Henley on its banks must have seemed the undisputed sanctuary of a privileged caste. Suddenly, to find greengrocers from Acton and printers from Fulham making free with their squalid little huts must have raised blood pressure to dangerous levels. And after all of that, the Town and Country Planning Act was brought in, the end. So, you know, we are again weird in Britain. Nobody else has this kind of, I think one of the questions was talking about this great fear of the unwashed in the countryside. That is not an exaggeration. It's practically there in black and white. And planning, in a way, everyone has got to unlearn aesthetics of emptiness, which are derived from a political outlook that is embedded, really, my opinion, within the British state. So it's a big one to get the show back on the road. And just as a small practical point, everywhere that there are huts, generally speaking, in Northern Europe, they are in forests. They're not in the landscape. And it's seen as very bad form, actually, in most of Norway, to have huts that are visible. And that's not because anyone's got big kind of problems about the wooden nature of them. It's just that they want to see undisturbed scenery. So our problem is also to do with the way forests are managed, owned, and built, if you like, or sown. And basically with Sitka spruce plantations, which are impenetrable, you can't walk through, and which destroy pretty much everything beneath them, it is very hard to see how huts fit into that. and to a forestry commission, which has generally had a door shut policy at night. So the reason that I'm interested in huts, they are the canary down the coal mine for land reform. They are the fact that they are so difficult to have, these modest things, tells you all sorts of stuff about really what's off kilter about our approach to people on the land in Britain and Scotland.
Yeah, so it's a big topic. Everything's connected to everything else. And yeah, thank you. Karen, we're kind of battling the planners a bit, aren't we? Because the kind of response that we're hearing about in different parts of the country is quite variable. And we've heard about Fife, which is kind of ahead of the curve in some ways, but other places aren't quite up to scratch, are they?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously Richard would have a lot more to say about the sort of culture of planners and that, but I'm also experiencing it firsthand as well in my own sort of situation. But I was going to say where we're at, because we're trying to change a thing that is difficult to change, and it takes, it's not going to change overnight, but every single person that puts in a planning application for a hut is doing a little bit of activism and education of planners and how, and it's making it easier for the next people that then come and try to apply for a hut. Reforesting Scotland's 1,000 Huts campaign we produced a guide to planning hutting developments from single huts to hut sites, and that is available on the 1,000 Huts website to download. And you can use that when you're thinking about your own hutting project. You can, even if you're not thinking about a hutting project, you could send it to your local planners and just say, have you seen this, and what's this planning authority's position on it? Because we're trying to encourage each planning authority to make their own policy on huts in their area, because obviously there's the Scottish Government policy that is quite encouraging to local authorities to have huts, but that each local authority has its own culture and its own prejudices and its own policy, and even, or it doesn't have, most don't have a policy, but even the ones that have well, I'm just thinking about Murray Council has adopted, for example, our Reforesting Scotland's hutting guidance as its guidance when people apply for a hut. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all these barriers are still not there in planners' minds. They're worried about high impact development in the countryside, so they can have sometimes a knee-jerk reaction to a low impact hut. So the crucial thing is to keep coming back to the definition of a hut, which really clearly says it's a very low impact development, and ensure that your plan for a hut fits within that definition and reinforces that idea of low impact, and then just keep chipping away and trying to educate planners that this is a healthy form of development in the countryside.
And finally, Ninian, can you say something about how you found it in Falkland? How you found planning?
Yeah, so gosh, how did we find planning? So I initially built 10 years ago, Donald was saying it was kind of, the gathering which is coming up this weekend. So 10 years ago, I'd started building Little Hut in Woods. And I was building that because I'm lucky enough to be part of an estate that owns a woodland. So I was kind of building a forest hut, really, kind of for a forester to go and do a bit of work and store a few things and have a bench on. And so initially kind of went in on a very kind of low key, which is still my hut in a sense. Then with a lot of help from Richard Heggie in particular, we went to and put in an application to Fife Council. And I can't remember quite how long it took, but it took quite a lot longer. I think, and I guess pioneering always takes a bit longer. So we had a number of hutters. We've been engaging with a hutters group now for, I don't know, gosh, 4 years or something like that. Could even be more or less. Anyway, kind of feels a bit of that kind of bit. And during that time, a number of people have kind of fallen off because, oh gosh, it has taken so long to get there. And it has, yeah, there's been more costs, taken a lot more time. But I think the more that people do this, the more people you have developing hut sites and learning out how, the easier it'll get. And so at the end of the day, I think Fife were always kind of relatively open, but they came back with, oh, I can't remember, 20 conditions. So, you know, there's a lot of conditions. It's not, that's been a bit challenged, but I think we're lucky to be in Fife. Anything else to say on that? Can I just say something about that kind of, I don't know, there's something about the relationship of a landowner and hutters, and I saw there was a question about gosh, I can't remember the specifics of it, but I think there are a number of a number of landowners who have come forward and who have tried to do this, and some who have succeeded. And I think there is certainly for us at Falkland, there's something about how to, gosh, you know, we have ownership, and I don't think we're going to abolish it in the next few decades. But I think there is something about how to develop a respectful relationship between tenants and landowners. And I don't think that should be impossible, but a landowner is holding something in a sense around the land for the long term, about, for us, the relationship with the tenant farmer who's been there generations. And there's a little bit of kind of balancing that. And also the local community, even though our hut site is a fair bit out of the village, you know, lots of people are thinking, oh, what is going on here? What is this about? And in a sense, so there's a little bit about whoever is holding the land. And if you own it, then you will pick up those things yourself. If not, the landowner has to kind of act as a bit of a bridge. And I think landowner-tenant relationships can get really messy. You know, the history of those relationships is not an easy one. But yeah, no, it's interesting, and oh, I love the Hutters group, and I know there's a few Hutters there, and I'm not just saying that, but actually it's been a fascinating journey for us. But it has taken a lot longer for the Hutters and for us as estate landowners to get there. But yeah.
Great. I mean, anything which is really worthwhile usually takes a fair bit of effort to achieve, doesn't it? So yeah, you're not going to get a hut just kind of falling out of a tree instantly. If you want that, you can go and sort of, you know, book a week in a chalet park, you know, and you can have a nice hutting experience that way, but you won't have a sort of like a family hut of the kind that is so common in northern countries. Francis, another question, please.
Okay, possibly the last question of the evening. If you were Supreme Ruler of Scotland and able to change one law or regulation to increase hutting, what would it be?
Who's feeling megalomaniac tonight? Maybe you'd like to answer that question, Francis. If you were Queen of Scotland, what would you change?
I'd say when you're born with a piece of land.
Yeah, very good. What would you change, Lesley? Just one thing.
Yes, I think it's it's the access to the land. So that's a nice one, Francis. You know, I can remember when I was younger, somebody went around all over Scotland saying, Scotland, this many million acres, I want my acre. Because when you've rationed it out, there's enough.
Anybody else like to change one thing?
I was just going to vote for Francis to be the supreme leader.
Yeah, I thought she was already. Linian?
Yeah, can I just, and just because I thought that was fantastic one, Francis, but just another one is something about building that because kids build dens, so actually an entitlement for people in school to learn how to build.
And Richard?
Yeah, I agree with Ninny, and I think it's about getting people back outdoors, get hands-on, doing things for yourself. We've all lost the ability to do things for ourselves, and it's interesting to confront the idea of actually building a hut and looking at the challenges that you'd find if you were going to try and do this yourself, because we've all got so used to everybody else having to do things for us, and that again is where this issue comes in with the cost of getting into hutting. Make it easy for people to do it themselves.
I'd like to have a Scottish government in power which truly believed in well-being. They've passed some ideas about well-being economies and so on, but if you truly believe in well-being, you'd be getting behind giving people access to the land and giving people the opportunity to have their own little bit of it with a hut to stay in overnight. And I'd also like to have a law which allowed you to have a hut and stay overnight at your allotment, and to have a lot more allotments, urban and rural fringe allotments, where you could grow your own food, and with a climate and ecological emergency coming rapidly down the line towards us, then I think growing our own food has got to be quite a good idea. And if you could combine that with having a hut where you could stay overnight and have your friends over and have a barbecue or even a sauna like they have in Finland, wouldn't that be a nice thing to be able to do? And Karen?
I was just going to say on the point that Ninian and Richard were making about learning to work with your hands from early childhood. I've been having conversations with a group who organised a festival called the Creative Bravery Festival, and they're looking at ways of how do you actually learn through hut building. One girl who's she's 13 and she's made a video about how hut building teaches her about all these different subjects that she could be, that she would be learning in a classroom, but instead she's learning it through hut building. And so this group's looking at trying to pull together more people that are interested in finding new ways of learning through doing. So if people have a specific interest in that, do get in touch, because we are going to be having some sessions online to explore those ideas more fully.
Thanks, Karen. And that was indeed our last question. I'm just going to do a bit of a kind of thank you, roll up everything together now. We do want to keep this discussion going because we kind of feel your energy, even though you're out there in the darkness and we can't actually see you. But we feel your energy, and we would like to facilitate your journey, which may or may not end up with having a hut at the end of it. And so there's various ways in which we would like to keep the conversation going. And the first of those is our resource hub. And Karen, can you say something about how that works?
Yeah, so in February, we launched the new resource hub, where we basically took together all the materials that we've been building up over the last few years, including our publications on planning and our publications on on hut construction and building regulations, plus all the other stuff around leases and hut site creation and loads of different issues that you can think of to do with hutting. So there's a huge reserve of information there, but there's also the forum, which is you can join easily by submitting your email address, and then you can have access to the forum. You can put in questions in the forum, and you can connect with a load of people. Say you want to get advice about some part of your build or some part of the process, you can submit a question. Or say you wanted to find other people who might want to buy land together or rent land together in a particular geographic area, put that question into the forum. Basically, whatever you want to use it for, you can submit it there. And you could also, as just a tip would be, if you submit it there and then you copy and paste it into a post on our Facebook group as well, you'll reach a wider audience and you'll generate more traffic on the forum for your post, so you're more likely to get a better response. So I just want to really strongly advise people to go there, have a look and see if that site can help you out, because there is literally hundreds of pages of information and resources on there.
Great. So as well as our wonderful, stylish resource hub, we also have our Facebook group, which Karen's mentioned, and which now has 8,500 members in the group. So that's kind of really grown over the last couple of years. And I think the Facebook group's really good either to tell us something about what you're doing, or something that you've heard, or some interesting information, share that, or else to ask quite a specific question, you know, about that you want an answer to, because there's a community out there of 8,500 people who, one of whom or several of whom might have some, you know, good ideas about what it is that you're looking for. So use it that way as well, and encourage you to do that. And then a third option, as a result of this book event, the Scottish Book Week event, we've decided that we're going to instigate a series of fireside chats. So we're going to have some Zoom meetings, and the first one's going to be next Wednesday. We'll send out information about it next Wednesday evening. It's basically whoever wants to come along. First one will be kind of fairly general. It'll be a kind of a Zoom meeting rather than a webinar format. So we'll be able to all see each other, and you'll be able to put your hand up and ask questions and generate a bit of discussion. If there's a lot of people, we'll use breakout rooms to divide it up a bit. And then we may, if there's a demand, we may carry that on for a bit longer based on topics. So we'll see what the most popular topics are, and then we'll have a meeting and we'll have a fireside chat, you know, about that particular topic, whatever it is that you'd like to talk about, and share that knowledge, and share that sense of direction, and share that sense of, you know, that we're going to make this happen in Scotland. Scotland isn't going to be the weird, different one from the rest of the countries around the Northern Hemisphere at this latitude. And if you're really keen in Reforesting Scotland, which set up the 1,000 Huts campaign, our annual gathering is this Saturday. So it's coming up in a couple of days' time. And you'll see a link to that on the Facebook page, or you can just Google Reforesting Scotland. Online this year, of course, but we'll get some really interesting talks and panel discussions about rewilding and such like. So you're very welcome to come to that as well. Lesley's got you've got your own Facebook and Twitter pages. Lesley, is that right? Do you want to give a quick plug for how people should keep in touch with you, or keep in touch with what you're doing? Do you want to say anything about that?
Yes, absolutely. But if people want to get the book, I sell books on my own website, lesleyriddoch.com. And there's a wee offer which is still on the go, which is free postage. It's essentially £3 off the book. So, and you know, just go for that. I can self-inscribe it however you'd like to have it. The other thing to say is that Landward, BBC Landward, filmed a thing about huts at Falkland. They interviewed me and Ninian, and that's on Thursday, the 26th, which is next Thursday, I think, at 8 o'clock. And it's repeated 2 or 3 times. So you might see glimpses of huts kind of happening there. So far away. Oh, I should have said on the, you just need to use the code on the website, 1,000 huts, like the number 1,000 huts. And that's what that's what gets £3 off. There you are. I feel so uncomfortable doing plugs, but you know, when you spent 10 years writing a book, you do want to see them just leave.
We'll send out a little email to everybody, which has got all this information on it and links on it. So don't worry if you're kind of scribbling down and you miss out a 0 out of the 1,000 huts. It'll still we'll get you the link. The Scottish Book Trust has got a lot of events this week. So yeah, support the other events which are happening with the Scottish Book Trust as a Scottish Book Week. Recommend them. Karen, do you want to say something?
I was just going to quickly say, so I've set it so that Eventbrite's going to send all the links to people after this session. So just check that if you're looking for it and you can't see it, just double check it didn't go into your spam folder, because it'll look as if it's a promotion coming from us. But just email me on huts@reforestingscotland.org if you don't receive that list of contacts.
Yeah, and for links and announcements, Facebook again, our Facebook group, it'll all be up there, so you can pick it up there. So I'd just like to finally thank all our panelists for participating in what has been kind of quite an unusual event for us, but it's been quite exciting, I think. And I want to thank Matt, who's in the background, who's been doing the tech stuff for us, and I think has done a fantastic job. You didn't know he was there, so he must have done a great job. And I want to thank Lesley for excellent presentation as usual. And I think I've seen it 3 times now, and it just gets better and better. And more connections, more and more connections with other stuff and other politics which is going on. And huts are kind of like a magical little metaphor for like lots and lots of other things. And as we always like to say in our Hutters rallies and our Hutters meetings, to the hills, to your huts, to happiness. And thanks for coming, and thanks for being here. Night night. See you in a hut sometime.